Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. So thank you for joining today's webinar, the ISO 2022 Revolution. Are you ready yet? Today's webinar is being presented by Volante Technologies in participation with NACHA. Before I hand over to our moderator, Nazreen Kuriba from NACHA, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make sure that we send you a link after the event. We welcome you to revisit the content itself and share it with colleagues as well. And of course, all the handouts as well as the presentation are available in this panel under the handouts section. If you have any questions or comments, please make sure that you use the questions panel, and we'll make sure that we answer them and pass them on to the speakers as well at any point. The speakers will then decide if they answer your question during the webinar or at the end. You'll also notice that we may be asking you a few core questions, and of course we would love for you to partake in those. And finally, if anyone is having any audio issues, please know that you can dial in to listen, and the dial-in numbers can be found in your registration email from GoToWebinar. Of course, if you have any difficulties, please make sure that you reach out via the question section, and we'll be happy to help you out. And with this, I'd like to introduce you to Nazreen. Nazreen, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tina, for those helpful notes, and welcome everyone to the webinar, The Coming ISO 2022 Revolution. Are you ready yet? So let me begin with a brief introduction of all the speakers. My name is Nazreen Kibria, and I am going to serve as the moderator for today's panel discussion. I am Senior Advisor, Innovations and Technology at NACHA. So I serve as the in-house ISO 2022 subject matter expert, and as part of my role, I, along with my colleagues, are active participants of key domestic and global ISO 2022 communities representing US ACH from the formal ISO 2022 organization to other groups like the CGI, which is the Common Global Implementation Market Practice, and that is a forum for banks, corporates, associations, vendors, market infrastructures to advance standardized practices of ISO 2022 globally, to participation with other US ISO 2022 stakeholders as part of the stakeholder group, and collaborating with the Federal Reserve Bank and the Clearinghouse. In the past 5 or so years, NACHA has led multiple efforts engaging the industry to educate and support ISO 2022 for the US ACH network. And I've actually played a key role in all of these, and I'm going to have an opportunity to discuss them shortly. But before I do so, let me turn it over to my esteemed panelists. And I'll first begin with Carl Slabicki of BNY Mellon. If you can say a few words about yourself and your organization.
Sure. Thanks, Nazreen. And hello, everyone. This is Carl Slabicki from BNY Mellon Treasury Services. I manage BNY Mellon's product line for immediate payments, which is essentially kind of new, faster emerging payment services, including real-time payments, the Clearinghouse RTP initiative, as well as our Zelle disbursement solution. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion today. And I'm going to be sharing some insights about how BNY Mellon has kind of approached this over the last several years. One of the key initiatives that we worked on was helping support the launch of the RTP network with the Clearinghouse and the other early adopting banks, and leveraging ISO as a standard message set to support not only the payments, but a lot of the business flows around that. So looking forward to sharing some information and having a good discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, Vinay Pragpar of Volante Technologies, if you can offer a few words on your background and about your organization as well.
Sure. Happy to do that, Nazreen, and welcome to everybody who's on the webinar. I'm Vinay Prabhakar, and I head up product marketing for Volante Technologies. For those of you not familiar with Volante, I thought I'd do a very quick introduction. We are a financial technology company. That means we serve primarily financial institutions. Our customers range from some of the largest banks. We have 4 of the 5 biggest corporate banks as customers, as well as to smaller institutions across the world. We also work with market infrastructures, card networks, corporations, essentially anybody who's involved in sending financial messages, sending and receiving them, whether for payments or other purposes. And what we do, really, in a nutshell, with our clients is we help them modernize. We help them simplify complexity so they can stay ahead of the curve. And it's a different story with each of our customers. In one case, it might be real-time payments. So certainly very proud, a privilege for us to work with Carl and his team at BNY Mellon so that they could be first to market with US RTP. But also on the corporate payable side, we work with banks to help them automate their onboarding processes. And we've recently gone live with our first client on payments as a service in the cloud on Azure. That's a European client for SEPA processing. I've been in the fintech industry, well, what's now called fintech, for nearly the past 2 decades. Most of the time, it's been a great ride, but I have to say now is a really exciting time to be in payments, because ultimately, almost everything that I've mentioned, real-time, payables on the corporate side, open banking, cloud, it has a common thread, and that is ISO 20022. So looking forward to talking more on that topic with all of you.
Great, thank you both. Now, before we dive in, I always like to take the pulse of the audience. So we'd like to take a poll of the attendees. And if we can put up the first question, it would be helpful to us to understand where your organization is in terms of ISO 20022 adoption. And this way we can appropriately focus our discussion. So please select the option that best describes the current status of ISO 20022 implementation. A, under consideration, in other words, it's an exploratory phase. B, are you planning in the planning phase? So maybe you're putting out an RFP or selecting the vendors. C, implementation phase. So perhaps working with vendors or banking or trading partners. Live, D, as in financial institution, you have perhaps implemented it for an integrated payable solution for ACH, wires, etc., or RTP, or both. And I'm saying this is A, B, C, D, E, by the way, just to be but otherwise you can consider it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th choice. And finally, not currently considering. So let me provide everybody a few more seconds to give everyone a chance to respond before we see the results. Tina, perhaps we can now see how people have responded. Oh, well, this is very fascinating. The fact that there are quite a few already under construction, and this is equally those in the planning phase as well as others that are live. And but there's also a significant group that's not currently considering. These are all very interesting stats to see, and I think it's going to be fascinating to look at it from the global context. Vinay, can you please share your insights about what's happening around the globe with ISO 20022 and perhaps dispel some myths about ISO 20022 as well?
Sure, yeah, happy to do that, and it'd be interesting to come back to those results later maybe as well. Let us start off with the basic question, right? So brief introduction, the basics. What is ISO 20022 or 22? There are, just for fun, we've got 3 answers to that question. One is from the book ISO 20022 for Dummies, great book, by the way. The other from Nudge's excellent frequently asked questions, FAQ, on the subject. And the last from everyone's favorite, Wikipedia. Now, you'll note that they're all somewhat different, and actually in the case of the first and last, quite different. So the question is, which is correct? Okay, well, it is a trick question because they are all correct. Going from right to left, ISO 20022 is an ISO standard for electronic data interchange between financial institutions. So that's accurate, but it's a bit narrow, right? Because we know that it's more than just FIs. Then we have ISO 20022 is the global messaging standard for financial business transactions. Okay, that's certainly comprehensive, and it's got that important word messaging in there. And then the last one, the most interesting one, broadest I should say, is it's a recipe for making financial message standards. It's a recipe for standards. And that's really powerful because that is probably ISO 20022's most important aspect. That rather than being a fixed standard, it's one which allows for organic growth and change, much like human language, which allows for huge variation in spelling, dialects, and so on, even allowing the creation of new words, right? While still having people be able to understand each other. Well, more or less. I guess it depends on which language and which dialects we're talking about. But in some ways, it's actually easier to talk about what ISO 20022 is not, because there are some common misconceptions about that. So let's get those out of the way. Firstly, it is not a format. So it generates formats, but it is not one format. And there's a lot of confused discussion in the world about ISO 20022 that comes from this misconception. So we wanted to get that out of the way early. The other one is that it isn't just payments or just one type of payments. It's not just SEPA or just RTP. It actually goes across all financial services. And on the next page, there's a you can see which domains it's applicable to. It isn't just XML, so probably the vast majority of transactions that most of us will deal with are in an XML format when it comes to ISO. But if it floats your boat, you can also send ISO compliant messages using ASN1, if that's your preference. Certainly not a purely cross-border standard. It's actually most of the applications globally are for domestic payments. And I think at this point, something like 90% of global RTGS volume, different kinds of wires globally, go through some kind of ISO-based RTGS clearing. It is not SWIFT specific, so SWIFT is an important player in ISO, but you don't have to be connected to SWIFT to take advantage of it. And very important, it's not only for banks. So, for example, corporations can exchange trade instructions with each other using ISO. Now, some of you who've been in this industry a while may be thinking, okay, but what's the big deal, right? How is this different from EDI or even ISO 15022, for those of you who know what that is, or many other acronyms? We could go into a lot more detail about how 20022 is more flexible than preceding standards, more adaptable, but ultimately the difference comes down to really one word, and that is adoption. If we look at the global adoption of ISO 20022, there's really no comparison to any other standard in terms of how broadly and widely this adoption has taken place. Round numbers, there are about 200 market infrastructures globally that are live or going live with ISO. And that's across multiple domains, as you can see, trade, securities, and payments, a very important part of that. Within payments, as you can see from the adoption map on the right from ISO, there is a lot going on. At Volante, we sit on a couple of ISO working groups. I think Nazreen mentioned both of the ones that she's on in the beginning. One is the RTPG, the Real-Time Payments Group, where we're involved in actually defining the message standards for real-time payments. We're also on the CGIMP forum, which is more about standards of financial messaging between banks and corporates. And we work directly with market infrastructures. So, for example, we have a rep working with the Bank of England, part of their working group that is migrating their wire system CHAPS to ISO 20022. So we have a front row seat, if you will, to a lot of this activity. I want to highlight a couple of areas which I think will be of interest to all of you. One is, let's start with something that's already been live for a while and is probably familiar to many of you. That's SEPA in Europe. That's probably the best known example of a payment scheme that is based on ISO 20022. It's live today, high volume, all kinds of messages going back and forth that are ISO based. Now that typical bulk SEPA, that's what's been live for over a decade now. But the year before last, same time, oddly enough, as TCH RTP, SEPA instant payments went live based on ISO as well. If you think about that, that's a situation where both in a region, a broad region, multi-country region, both low-value bulk payments and instant payments are on the same standard. They're not necessarily using the exact same messages or even the same networks, but it is the same standard. So from a corporate perspective, Any corporate that's able to send SEPA and ISO, and they pretty much all do, they can easily extend their messages to support instant payments as well. It's also easier for banks. Although supporting instant payments isn't always straightforward, at least they don't need to be concerned about a totally different message standard. Another important global initiative is the conversion of Swift MT traffic to MX. So basically the old MT 103s, 202s, and so on that were based on 15022, migrating them to 20022 using, in this case, XML-based messages. So any organizations or systems that send or receive MT messages are going to have to convert to MX. There is going to be a coexistence period, but we think this is something really that anybody who transacts with MT should be looking at now, because it isn't going to be a straightforward mapping exercise. Last one is just north of the border, Payments Canada. They've released a very aggressive modernization roadmap. They plan to transform all of their clearings, their wire and ACH equivalents, and put in a new real-time rail, all based on ISO 2022 by 2022 or 2023, 5 years basically. So aggressive roadmap. And one of the interesting things is one component of their business case for this is reduction of check volume. They anticipate that once modernization is in place, about $4.5 billion will be saved, $1 billion will be saved by converting to paper to electronic and encouraging the spread of ISO-based messaging. Certainly something that could be relevant to the US, where we're obviously still very dependent on checks. So there's a lot more we could talk about here, but in interest of time, Nasreen, I will hand back over to you.
Great. So Vinay and if you can see the map in front of us, has mentioned the convergence towards the ISO 2022 standard around the globe, whether it's replacing the legacy infrastructure or developing real-time payment systems. And here in the US, we have the single largest payments market in the world, and we have similar changes happening on the horizon. So let's take a look at some of the key US stakeholders and, what are they doing around ISO 2022? Thank you. If we can, great. So looking at not just ISO 2022 activities, part of addressing the needs of the present, NACHA is facilitating the integration of ISO 2022 with ACH. Now, what many may not be aware is that NACHA was involved in the development of the standalone remittance messages led by IFX and a collaborative effort with Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Wells Fargo. So the REMT 001 and REMT 002 messages are not only part of the XML ACH remittance opt-in program, which was launched by NACHA in August 2013 to enable the expansion of B2B electronic payments, but it's actually now part of the Clearinghouse RTP message set, as well as other global efforts. And since that time, NACHA has taken a key role in providing additional tools and resources to allow ACH users to translate and integrate the ISO 2022 payment message standard for both electronic payments and remittance information. So what was happening is that there was a lot of requests from banks that were struggling and noting the potential differing interpretations of ISO 2022. So NACHA moved to provide a standardized guidance on translating the ISO 2022 messages to corresponding ACH transactions, publishing the ISO 2022 ACH mapping guide in 2015. Now, I was fortunate to lead that effort among other notable ISO 2022 programs and to work with some very fine financial institutions, including our representative bank from BNY Mellon, who we have on our panel today. And based on the interviews conducted, as well as speaking with subject matter experts around the globe, among the guidance we offered was to leverage the version 3 of the payment instruction. Partly, as Vinay noted, SEPA is actually the largest implementation of ISO 2022 in the world. And we found, based on both primary and secondary research, it's also the prevailing version that's being used in the US market as well as globally. And as well as it is the advocated by the CGI market practice group that, again, Vinay was mentioning. And of course, it's also mandated by the European Payments Council for the SEPA implementation. Now, a year later, what we did was we actually enhanced those, the mapping guide and tools. And then subsequently, what began to happen is that NACHA started receiving a lot of requests from banks to help them review their ISO 2022 files that they were getting from their corporate customers. And initially, this was a manual effort. And as you can imagine, that's error prone. So this led to the launch of the NACHA ISO 2022 validator in 2017, developed by Volante Technologies, and who's also on the panel. And it's a tool to help validate the mapping of ISO 2022 payment instructions into ACH file formats and a complement of NACHA's ISO 2022 mapping guide. Now, a more recent program that was launched in early 2018 is the Request for Payment program. Its objective is to be able to deliver bills and request money via the ACH network, because as many of us know, today billers still deal with significant exceptions because payments can't be applied appropriately. So with RFP, buyers can pay based on information that the biller just gave, and then it enables the billers to apply cash applications more efficiently and timely. And this is the same message that's actually being utilized by the clearinghouse RTP. Now, beyond these integration efforts, NACHA is also continuing to prepare for the future and collaborating with the other stakeholders in relation to the ACH, and specifically the Federal Reserve and the clearinghouse if the ACH network were to ever be replaced with ISO 2022 messages. Now, if we move on to the next slide, while NACHA has been focusing on integration, the operators of the wire systems, the Federal Reserve and the clearinghouse, have taken a different approach, and they are converting their wire systems to ISO 2022. And outlined here on this slide, if you've attended any of their sessions, you're going to be very familiar with this. And essentially, their approach is in several phases with an ultimate mandated sunset date of their legacy proprietary formats. And in the initial phase, they're requiring all financial institutions to be able to receive ISO 2022 messages by November 2020. And then by phase 2, they're going to require all financial institutions to be able to send ISO 2022 messages. And then in the final phase, and this is where it gets interesting, not only will the legacy formats be sunsetted, but then FIs and along with their corporate clients will be able to leverage ISO 2022 and it's an enhancement. Now, one of the things that I do want to note is that the wire message will be on version 7 or potentially even later of the ISO 2022 messages. Now, this is a divergence from NACHA's approach, which has been based on the corporate usage here in the US as well as globally. And then finally, Vinay also alluded to this as well in terms of talking about the Swift MT messages migrating away from their own proprietary format to ISO 2022. And its plan is to align with the timing of the Eurozone's conversion of their high-value system. And their approach is very similar to the WIRE's approach in terms of having an ISO preparation phase, then a like-for-like, and an eventual enhancement to full ISO. Now, if we move to the final slide, if we think about real-time or instant payments, so unlike the other payment systems that I was just talking about, when you have any new system that is built from the ground up, you also have the benefit of building it using the most advanced technologies. And so like all the majority of instant payment systems that's been built globally in the past couple of years, the clearinghouse designed, built, and launched a real payment system in November 2017, built on the ISO 2022 standard, and highlighted here are the specific ISO 2022 messages. Now, I don't know if you noticed something, but I had talked about the Request for Payment program by NACHA, and similarly, if you observe on top, one of the core messages of the Clearinghouse RTP is the Request for Payment message. And when NACHA developed its RFP program, this was an effort to harmonize to the extent possible with its usage in the RTP system. So if a corporate wanted to send a payment or request, they have the option, and this is the, of course, utopia and ideal scenario, right? That in the future, they would be able to instruct the payment to either be in real time, same day ACH, or just regular ACH. I mean, what a great time to be a corporate. And one of the final notes I want to mention about instant payment systems is that I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Federal Reserve Banks put out a request for comment at the end of last year on the possibility of standing up its own instant payment system, and that too would be built on ISO 20022. Now, with that background, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and actually now ask Carl, as a representative of BNY Mellon, because they were an early adopter of ISO 20022 back in 2012, as well as a pioneer in launching the RTP system that's based on ISO 20022, right? And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is, what prompted BNY Mellon to adopt ISO 20022, and where are you seeing where have you seen possibly the largest demand and market opportunities in relation to ISO 20022?
Yeah, thanks, Nazarene. It's just a great question. So when we look at the broader landscape, kind of, going back to all the things that, you and Vinay just kind of covered in detail, which is the vast number of markets continuing to adopt ISO 20022, even within a lot of those markets, like you just highlighted within the US. Some of the legacy payment systems that process the majority of the payments within countries are undergoing, and they're all at different phases of some sort of migration, or at least exploring a migration within this direction. It just makes sense from leveraging common functionality and messaging and language between systems. And when we look at kind of how we integrate with a lot of the payment systems today across the globe, how we interact with our banking partners globally, as well as our corporate clients, there's such a variety of formats, whether you're leveraging Swift messaging, ISO standards, some sort of proprietary format, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you go bank by bank or corporate by corporate, there's such a wide mix of what each entity is required to support, which is, it creates challenges when you're looking to ultimately connect to new business partners or networks or markets. And I think, the premise for this always comes back to the need. ISO 20022 is this new common language, and we always kind of start with, so why should we do this? Whether it's us as a bank or, in talking with a lot of our clients across various industries. And it always typically comes down to, well, if this trend is going to continue, meaning there's going to continue to be more payment networks that are built either domestically or on a global basis. And, as you just mentioned, real-time payments was the first brand new U.S. payment system in over 40 years. And you talked about the Federal Reserve potentially building another RTGS system on top of that potentially in the next couple of years. You have other markets, as Vinay mentioned, Canada, not only redoing some of their existing rails, but building a new RTP rail. So the trend of there's more networks I need to connect to continues to grow. So banks have a challenge, which is, okay, if we're going to be expected to connect to and support and provide servicing in and out of these networks, we need to do something to make that more efficient, and to leverage some commonalities between them. And then when you take a step back behind the banks and you look at the consumers of these payments, whether that's a large institutional business client, like a large corporate, a brokerage investment firm, a small business, or a consumer, through some sort of, mobile application, for example, you have to tie these pieces together. You can't have these siloed solutions that continue to stand there. So how do you get a small business or a large corporation access to RTP and wire and check and ACH and Zelle messaging and new networks in other countries, and you continue to grow and expand that? So it's the interesting part is we saw ISO 20022 as kind of the clear route to be the framework to kind of let us move down that path in the most efficient manner. leveraging standards where we can. And obviously, as you highlighted, not every market or network is currently supporting that. And adoption varies even throughout, the US market when you go downstream to corporates and ERP systems and treasury workstations and things of that matter. But it does provide the best chance at leveraging, one common development effort from a mapping exercise into local systems to reach the most number of endpoints possible. And one example that I'll state is we have a lot of corporate clients undergoing ERP migrations, moving to new ERP platforms like SAP, et cetera, Oracle. They're implementing new treasury workstations with a variety of vendors, et cetera. And they're really using those as catalysts to prompt themselves to revisit how they connect and communicate with their bank partners. And they have, the same challenges. Maybe they have multiple bank partners. They're consuming services such as, information reporting, payment initiation, payment tracking. They have to be able to support wires and ACH and check, and some of the new payment services like RTP, Zelle, et cetera, within the US market, and continue to grow their reach on a global landscape to open up new currencies and markets that they can pay into and receive out of. So when they look at that and they see that same trend that we as a bank sees, they typically say, okay, this is the time where it makes sense. We want one single common method and format and language that we're speaking with all our bank partners. And we don't want to go to a bank and say, we'd like to consume these 5 payment services and get 5 different documents back from them saying, here you go, you have 5 IT projects under your plate. So even though the market and the network continue to expand in terms of options and solutions and payment systems, there's a tremendous effort within the banks and the global community and a lot of the standards organizations that Nazarene and Vinay both mentioned earlier, to try to bring that together to one common language to essentially relieve the burden on those corporates and businesses and individuals that ultimately want to connect to these. So that the gateway to entry to some of these new systems like RTP, as you see here, becomes a lot lower. And I think RTP was an interesting, it was certainly interesting going through this over the last several years in working with the clearinghouse and the other early adopting banks to really go through the standards. And as Nazarene mentioned, RTP is more than just a payment. So it's a real-time payment, 24/7, 365, finally irrevocable, but it really comes loaded with a lot of value-added messages, facilitating the entire payments process that you can see there on the right side of the screen. You can see the different individual message types that are used, whether it's a pain 13 for a request for payment or a pain 14 for a response, a remittance 001 message for additional remittance advice that can be sent along with a payment or a request. And then all the exception processing. Why did you skip this invoice? Why was this underpaid? Can you return my funds? This was paid in error, and all the exception processing. So not only from a payment initiation standpoint, but going back to Vinay's points earlier on what ISO is, it's truly a full language that can be utilized around the payment process. And I think when banks and corporates look to adopt ISO and some of the networks that are supporting ISO, some of the questions that need to be asked are, how does this fit within the systems today? And is there a something similar and common that we can relate this back to? For payment initiation, it's probably fairly easy, but are there automated processes today around some of these other value-added message types? Additional remittance advice. How is that data being stored and processed and sent between business partners today? How are the exceptions being handled? So at the bottom of the screen, when we have requests for information and requests for return of funds, some of those things are typically manual processes. And how are these going to ultimately fit into an ERP system or a treasury workstation or a billing system for that matter? And are the vendors and parties providing those services able to meet these ISO standards? So it's raised a lot of, I think, interesting questions and challenges, because ultimately, now that some of these networks are supporting it and the banks are supporting it, the next wave of migration is to ultimately have the corporates and a lot of their vendors adopt this as a standard, so we can get that connectivity to these vital endpoints. And I think the standards organizations are going to play a very big role here over the next couple of years, because as we've built out standards here within the U.S. for the RTP network specifically, we have to ensure that as NACHA and Fed and the wire system go through their exploration, and if and when they migrate to ISO 20022, that we're leveraging a common standard. And as Vinay showed that map of the globe, this isn't just a standalone domestic economy. We live in a global economy. So as these networks and cross-border activities start connecting for real-time payments, and as we start sending real-time payments abroad in the future, connecting to some of the real-time channels of Australia, UK, Singapore, and so on, even though they're using ISO standards, we have to make sure that we're using them in the same way, and that the fields are being leveraged in a common manner with common rules and logic, and that the systems that ultimately feed into that from the businesses and the end users have the same expectations, which is not easy. That will continue to be an important effort for a lot of these standards groups going forward. But if done right, this I think has the best chance of being a true global standard for a lot of networks and providers that we really haven't had this much progress with, as far as I can remember. So it's an interesting time, but I think the RTP migration kind of gave us a lot of insight as to both the possibilities and the challenges and the things that we need to work on and overcome over the coming years.
Oh, thank you. Those were very helpful insights, particularly, and some of the things that you mentioned are common themes that I've heard with various financial institutions as well as corporations, and that, one of the attractive aspects of ISO 20022 is that it is a single pipe in a sense. You can send one payment instruction, it's payment agnostic, and so you can actually, send an instruction for an ACH, an RTP, FX, etc. And you made a very interesting point regarding the fact that with ISO 20022 now being leveraged elsewhere, it's actually lowering the barrier to entry for RTP. But I also find it fascinating as far as the richer information that you alluded to with ISO 20022 and all the various capabilities in terms of not only just sending a payment instruction when it's a credit advice, but also getting acknowledgments or investigating various issues, etc., or to be able to even send remittance information, vast remittance information, which today continues to be a challenge. But with that, I want to now ask Vinay your thoughts on what are some of the value-added services that you've observed with your banking customers, or even corporations who are working with their banks. What are they taking advantage of with ISO 20022?
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. And I think Carl quite eloquently covered many of the drivers from the corporate side, so I won't repeat them. But essentially, when it comes down to business opportunities, for banks, payment service providers, what have you, it really comes down to solving those corporate needs. Banks that can more effectively address those needs through the provision of value-added services, in the end, are going to be able to compete better. So if we just quickly go through those, some of those needs, well, corporations need to increase straight-through processing, right? Because it's expensive for them to have manual processes. They need to manage multiple bank relationships. They have pain points with reconciliation. I think that's something Carl mentioned. And fraud as well. You look at invoice fraud, for example, median loss per event, about 100K, so it's real money. And that's where using a mechanism like, for example, request for pay, whatever network it is, that can really help because it is electronic ISO messaging all the way. Invoice, payment, remittance are all part of that workflow. So what it comes down to, I think, is looking at those corporate needs and then mapping them back to all these different ISO-based services, what they can actually provide. The key thing really, though, from a bank perspective is, and we see this mistake made sometimes, particularly with banks who are just kind of getting their feet wet with this, is not to think of ISO 2022, not to think of the file format as a product, if that makes sense, right? Because that is not going to be very interesting for anybody. But what is the service that you can deliver around that messaging standard? So I already mentioned, request for pay as a fraud reduction service, but ISO as a reconciliation reduction service, I think would be very compelling. Or, for example, looking at taking key services that the bank provides and putting them out as APIs, which can consume and put out ISO-based responses, for example. All of those things, I think, are very viable. It's only really the largest banks that can do all of them, but I think banks of any size can pick one of these and make a real difference for themselves in their markets.
Thank you, Vinay. I want to switch gears a little bit and now look at, obviously, both Carl and Vinay provided some helpful observations, and we've been looking at the positive aspect of ISO 2022, but it's also useful to look at the issues around ISO 2022. So with that, before I ask the panelists, I would be interested to hear from the audience on some of your own experiences. If we could pull up the second poll question. So for those organizations who made the decision to implement ISO 2022, and we saw that it was around 40% who were considering basically an exploratory phase or planning to, and of course there's another significant chunk who are live as well. We would be interested to hear, what was the biggest challenge you encountered? Whether is it insufficient resources, budget, understanding ISO 2022 XML message and format. So in other words, the learning curve, the development of internal competency, whether it's technology issues with legacy systems and bringing them up to date, new processes and procedures, including testing with ISO 2022, because ISO 2022 as a standard works very differently from the proprietary messages we have in place today, whether it's Nacha, file format, or Fedwire, chips, etc. And lastly, versions and variations in usage. So I'll give everyone a couple of moments to think it over and then select one of the options. Should we take a look at the results? All right, so wow, a fairly significant group has dealt with technology issues with legacy systems, and this is followed by understanding ISO 2022 XML message format, and which is quite understandable. I'm actually surprised about the insufficient resources and budget, but that may be also because attendees are aware of the changes that are coming down the pike and have actually budgeted for them in coming future. So now, looking at these responses, and the hard truth is that although businesses may desire to move to ISO 2022, the journey is just not so easy or straightforward one. And so now I want to ask Carl, a question to you is, what are the challenges that BNY Mellon encountered, or you can think of banks in general, in terms of implementing ISO 2022?
Yeah, I think a couple things that come to mind is when we look at the message set that's available to us, and we kind of look at where we've come from in terms of how, what we've used to communicate with bank partners and clients and networks and things in the past. The fact that we're going to such a, the ISO set itself is so dynamic and it's so vast that there's what we found, to I guess our surprise was there's so much within there that we haven't used that is potential for additional information and value-added pieces that can be built around different processes. So if you're migrating from an old legacy, communication means to an ISO standard, you have a lot more at your disposal. So you can carry over some of your old information and keep business as usual, but there's a lot of other things there that can be leveraged as well. And I think the challenge is around some of those new fields and capabilities and additional values and things of that nature is understanding how the business is going to leverage that across the market. So how are other providers going to look to these fields? And just kind of drawing back to what we've dealt with the launch of real-time payments in the U.S. Within some of those core message types, we've spent quite a lot of time going through field by field, drawing upon, how is each bank going to interpret the use of each one of these new fields, and what are we going to expect within here, because we've never used them before, or we've never had that need in certain other networks and communication channels. And not only how are we going to have a common understanding of leveraging the full scope of this standard, but how are we going to display this down to our clients? And a quick example of that is something that we've created for the RTP network, which I'm sure other networks are doing the same of, which is kind of common display guidelines. Within this field and this tag, there's a ISO, formatting name for a specific field. But what are we going to call that so that the end user, business, corporate, et cetera, that sees this information displayed to them, through a banking, channel experience or through some other means, knows that it's the same thing regardless of what bank or, provider they're coming through. So it's really been, the challenge from our side has been looking to the full data set, realizing how much potential there actually is, thinking about where it makes the most sense to continue leveraging the rest of that value, and then trying to coordinate with industry partners to make sure that we all have the same expectation as to how those new fields and values are going to be used. And I always go back to, I like Vinay's analogy earlier, which is it's a language, and we're in the place right now that we've added a lot of new words that we're saying we're all going to start using more frequently. And we want everyone to know that these new words that we're going to be using more frequently have the correct meaning on the other end. Is essentially what we're trying to do with some of these new message sets. So it's and we're trying to do it use case by use case, and see where it makes sense. But making sure that everyone has the same meaning of these new words that we're going to be leveraging is a pretty key challenge.
Thank you, Carl. And just to be cognizant of time, I'm going to move forward a little more rapidly. So I want to change gears again a little bit, Vinay, and maybe delve a little bit deeper. And this, in fact, also alludes to one of the questions and issues that is offered in the question that was put forward in the poll. And it's really about the issue of versions. So a key concern that's emerged, and with our own initiatives at NACHA and market assessment, we identified that corporate customers, predominantly those with an international footprint and exchanging ISO 20 or 22 with their banks and other technology partners, that they've generally been on version 3 of the payment instruction. And then relatedly, most of the large global banks, they're also using the same versions for their international and internal business processes and systems. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, the intent of the Federal Reserve Bank is to migrate to the newest version of ISO 20 or 22, while RTP is on version 6. So I'd be curious to hear, what have you heard from your banking clients in terms of how they will address this challenge?
Yeah, it's it is a tough challenge. There isn't an easy answer, because what it means is changing mindset a little bit and thinking, again, not in terms of format mappings, but actually of language translations, right? So we're working with a lot of banks right now to help them with what I would call higher order translation of messages. So to extend the the language analogy, the word football means three very different. It's the same word, means three very different things in the U.S., U.K., Australia. Right? They're actually three different sports. So in a financial context, what's needed is technology that basically understands not just that field A maps to field B or tag Y, but what the meaning of quote unquote football or legal entity identifier or beneficiary is in the different formats and versions. So one piece of that is our work that we've done in providing validation tools and test validation tools for messages. So for example, with the ones that we've collaborated with Nacha on, the Nacha validator, where anybody can go to the Nacha resource page and use a very simple tool that will allow them to upload files and make sure that those ISO files are appropriately mappable into and out of US ACH transactions with the right context, and knowing that a particular ISO message or PAX or pane is mappable to appropriately to a CCD or a PPD. So part of it is having the right documentation, which is obviously available on that resource page, but also the right tool set. But again, the key thing is changing mindset from format maps to business process and business translation maps. That really is the key.
Vinay, while I agree with part of your statement as far as having the right tools and having something like a validator is definitely helpful and key, but in terms of when you're dealing with various versions of financial messages, unfortunately it does just come right down to having to deal with various mapping, etc. Carl, I want to pose the same question to you because I'm very curious. How is BNY Mellon planning to handle the issue of all these versions? Because I have heard from other financial institutions that this is going to be a serious challenge.
Yeah, it is a serious challenge. When you look at this, you have to essentially support multiple versions at the same time to make that transition, which is a challenge, and you have to take a very detailed look as to what your the mapping logic, and making sure you're not dropping anything that is key, making sure you're not truncating any issues. And I think one of the questions came in was specifically around truncation, which is how do we ensure? I think this is a common challenge that it's not just with ISO versioning, but it's with any kind of mapping exercise within a bank or within a corporate, which is when we're sending financial messaging between parties or between internal applications, for example, and different formats are required, or different versions of the same standard, or how do you really ensure that all of the data goes through to the right spot, and that you're not losing any? And it's, there's no simple kind of, magic wand to do that. It's a lot of detailed work. It's a lot of kind of detailed looking at exactly what fields are going there, and, trying to see, and I think that's where talking with peers in the industry becomes very helpful, to try to make sure that whatever solutions you come up with to manage that, and things you put in place to manage that transition, that you rely on some industry peers to kind of talk to and work through to make sure you're all going through kind of a common path together.
That's a really great point, Carl. And I would say, part of it, definitely discussing things with your industry peers, participating in forums like the CGI market practice that I was talking about, where you can discuss standardized approaches, and at the same time also participating in educational opportunities like this webinar, right? However, we are almost near the hour and we have so many questions that we received. So what I want to do is just rapidly try to, talk about some of the more straightforward ones. I'll respond, but I'll also put forward a little more of the complex ones to you too. One of the questions is, what is the difference between Swift MX and ISO 20 or 22? The Swift MX message is their ISO 20022 message. That's how they've named it. Just straightforward, that's what it is. Another question is, and I'll ask this of Carl, and I'm happy to answer it as well. My financial institution has enabled ISO 20022 for ACH origination. Our third-party vendor that converts our customer files from ISO 20022 to NACHA format before they are pushed to the Fed. The piece we are struggling with is how to enable payment status and debit and credit notification reports. How are other financial institutions handling this specifically with regards to ACH?
Yes, so I guess what I'll say there real quickly is, and this is fairly common where we see banks are enabling a kind of a comprehensive channel of taking in ISO messages from clients for multiple payment types. Banks are doing the translation into whatever the local network needs, in this case a NACHA format for ACH. And in a lot of cases, banks are also formatting advice confirmations back to their clients for either debit or credit notifications. So I know, specifically BNY Mellon, as we look through this, whether it's an API-driven notification or files, we try to say, okay, what confirmation do you need back? What format does it need to come in? In a lot of cases, we've done, an ISO, debited confirmation or credit confirmation in that format. And again, we're kind of in the middle doing that translation.
And I'm going to just speak to, based on many of the dialogues I've had with other financial institutions. So very similar to BNY Mellon, other banks are providing their statuses and notifications based on obviously what the corporates are asking. And, and by the way, payment statuses, there is a mapping available from NACHA on ISO 20022 to some of the acknowledgments, etc. That having been said, it really differs from financial institution to financial institution and corporation to corporation as far as what their needs are and what their requests are. And of course, as you can see here, we have provided all of our contact information, and so we're more than happy to dive a little more deeply into the question, whoever posed it, if you would like. And then someone else wrote, isn't ISO 20022 message just XML based? No, it isn't. So ISO 20022 is actually syntax agnostic. So in other words, it's not specific to XML. As Vinay provided earlier, it is predominantly used in XML, or however, it can be applied to other formats as well. One of the other ones that is applicable to today is ASN.1. However, it's increasingly being used in JSON with APIs. Now, what I would like to do is just turn it over to both of our panelists to offer any, closing remarks as far as, what effective strategies that people can take away in implementing ISO 20022 and potentially pitfalls to avoid as well. Vinay, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be very quick. My advice really to banks in terms of how to approach this is to focus on the business roadmap, right? Figure out what services based on ISO you can provide to your clients and prospects so that you can have something differentiated. And then make sure your IT roadmap is driven by that, whether it's replacing systems, upgrading them, putting in new technology and so on. That will make sure that that your IT roadmap ultimately supports the business result that you want for your market.
Yeah, and I'll give a quick last tip as well, kind of in line with what Vinay was saying. I'd say look at areas that you're adding or combining. What are the payment types, networks, or partners that you're looking to add? And in those cases where you're going to need to do some integration, look to this as a standard because it will give you a foundation to leverage for things in the future. And then where are you looking to combine? Where are you looking to combine payable files, other types of information, rich data sets for invoicing, et cetera, between business partners or your banks, et cetera. and where does it make sense to combine into kind of a single common format. So adding and combining are kind of great catalysts to explore this to see if and when it makes sense.
Great, good points for both of you. And I just wanted to add that, there are resources available on all the websites, including at NACHA. There's an ISO 2022 resources webpage with white paper that actually highlights some of the value-added services or opportunities that organizations can take advantage with ISO 2022, as well as the challenges and what are some of the focus areas you should look at in terms of future roadmap with ISO 2022. And so with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us at today's webinar, particularly Carl and Vinay, especially for sharing your insights and expertise. So as mentioned by Tina at the beginning of this call, this was recorded and available to you for future reference. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.